Hey everyone, I'm Lucy, and joining me today is Marcus Lehto, President and Game Director over at V1 Interactive on Disintegration. Marcus, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Lucy. It's nice to be here.
So people know you, obviously, from your work on the Halo franchise a few years ago when you were working at Bungie, but then you kind of left the AAA life behind, went into a more independent game development lifestyle. Where and when were the seeds of Disintegration sown? When did you know that you wanted to move away from Halo, from that franchise, and make something else?
It wasn't actually too long after I left Bungie. I kind of did some exploration here and there. I looked at big AAA games and little mobile games and a lot of different types of game universes for a while. I spent about 2 years before I finally landed on this one idea that I had kind of had some sketches for as far as the fiction is concerned. I kept coming back to it as something that really interested me, and the more I come back to it, the more intrigued I was with the universe and the capabilities that it had. And so I decided to actually start putting some effort into building a prototype around that idea.
I'm a big sci-fi fan, and I think for me, the thing that draws you into a particular piece of sci-fi is the world that's been created. So it's really cool to know that that was the seed for it. It wasn't the gameplay, it was creating this universe. Can you talk a little bit more about what the state of the universe would be as you load into Disintegration?
So the fiction of the story is set about 150 years from now. It actually, while I started the fiction for this over 6 years ago, one of the issues that I was dealing with in this fiction was that humanity was being pitted against several different issues that were creating some severe difficulties and potential extinction event as well. So that was something that, as a result of these issues that humanity was dealing with, that taking the actual brain from a human and integrating that into a robotic entity was a means of survival. And it was really meant to be a temporary solution until real solutions could be solved and that brain could be reintegrated with a clone version of their body and they could become human again. That was the big rosy picture that they painted for themselves, but that didn't work the way they had planned. And so in this future, those that have been integrated, some of them decide to split away and become this militarized force, and they don't want to become human again. But you and a group of other folks like you decide to fight back and separate from that and join with the natural humans and be part of that part of humanity that's so important to them. And that's who we play in this game. That's where our fiction is set in the future, and that's where we really dive into the individual characters within the world and the interest that they have with one another.
So I was playing a little bit last night. I was playing through some of the single player, and what I really liked about it is that between the missions and before we get onto the gameplay itself, there are these moments of respite where you're sort of walking around, I guess, your home base, and you're chatting to everyone and just getting these snippets of the lore. Where did that idea... It reminded me actually of Mass Effect a little bit. You do a mission, then you check on everyone because you want to build up that rapport with your crew. Where did that come from, and how did you start to build out this crew, this motley crew that you're hanging around with?
Yeah, to that event, we wanted the between missions for the player to be able to just come back to a home base, a place where they could, feel comfort, take a breather, get to know some of the other characters. It's an optional kind of thing for the player to do, where they can interact with some of the other story characters in that environment and get a little bit more information from them about what their motivations are and such. When it comes to those characters, each one of them are, like I was saying, they're unique individuals. They're not genetically modified, super trained super soldiers or anything like that. They're just normal folks like journalists, teachers, mechanics, game developers, maybe, who knows? There's a normal people who are pitted under extraordinary circumstances with a will to survive. And it's these characters that, while they come from all walks of life, they have this common bond pulling them together, this will to survive and to one day become human again. And so at the beginning of the game, we escape from the enemy, the Rayon enemy in our game. And we are kind of just pulled together with this group that they have to get to know each other and how to work with one another and how to trust one another throughout the game. And that's where the crux of all the interesting stuff happens between them.
So you've kind of fleshed out this world and you're fleshing out these characters. Let's talk a little bit about the gameplay, because it is this hybrid of a first-person shooter, if you want it to be, like you're controlling the grav cycle, or it's an RTS, essentially, you're commanding units. Mm-hmm. Where did that idea come from?
The game actually started out as strictly an RTS type game. It was very standard, band select, micromanage units on the ground, all set within this universe. But it wasn't too long into that development of a prototype, very, very early prototype, that I said to myself, this is just never going to stand out amongst the sea of other games that are like this. And while I liked what we were creating, I liked the simulation of combat on the ground. That was one of our primary focuses of making that really interesting to watch. I decided that we needed to do something dramatically different. So it was one of those things late at night, when you just wake up in the middle of the night with an idea. And this one was turning that camera in the sky into an active participant in combat, like giving the player the agency to involve themselves fully in what's happening in gameplay. So we turned that camera into a vehicle we now call a grav cycle, and you're the pilot of that grav cycle with onboard offensive and defensive weapons, but you're also then commanding those ground units. And it required us to completely rethink how you can interact with those ground units in a way that doesn't overwhelm the player and is in keeping with the fluidity of that first-person shooter mechanic. And so that took us quite a long time to iterate on that gameplay cycle and really hone in and find that core nugget that was just golden, that turned into something really cool and special. It took us a long time to finally get to a place where we were excited and comfortable, with the core combat loop and those core gameplay mechanics. But because there's nothing else out there like this, so we couldn't go chase the tail of another game. We had to invent all new mechanics for how that works, and I think we got it down to this really nice fluid gameplay experience that. While it's a little hard to describe, I think once players jump into the game and get a hands-on experience with it, I think they'll really appreciate what we've created.
It's a strange thing to have to pitch to people, because you can pitch to the RTS crowd and you can pitch to the first-person shooter crowd, but you can also encourage them that you could swap sides. You can do either one. What was the moment? Can you describe the moment where things clicked in terms of the gameplay?
It took some time when we were going through this iteration cycle of trying to figure out how to command those ground units. Initially, we were still trying to allow micromanagement of them. And it wasn't until we said, let's just let go of that. And let's boil things down to their bare essence, the most important parts of what we really want to get across. And then we got to this point where we turned that ground crew into a solid entity themselves. Like, it might be as few as 2 ground units and as many as 4, each of whom have a unique ability that you can use tactically in gameplay. But we wanted to make sure that they did smart contextual things on the ground based on your decisions that you give them, your commands that you give them. And we do that through a command pulse. And it was the invention of this command pulse that literally fires out of your grav cycle down onto the ground. You can position them in the environment using that. You can priority target an enemy. You can even select objectives within in the environment, such as things that they need to interact with for story purposes, or for picking up stuff like salvage in the game that you use as a currency when you come back to that home base. And so it wasn't until we got to that point where we started really honing in on how that mechanic works and how smart those AI needed to be on the ground that finally it all began to click, and we knew that I think we were getting to the home stretch then of what we needed to do on the design side.
So you said you had this idea 6 years ago. What was the process like of building the team to execute that idea?
It took a while because I didn't want to go to a publisher and do a whole bunch of hand waving and smoke and mirrors or just a PowerPoint presentation saying, hey, it's just me and I'd like to build a studio and this game idea. So I hired a couple college students who were still in their senior year and to help me out on the engineering side. And we took our time to slowly go through this process of building a prototype that we could use as a solid example for the design mechanics and for the overall intent of what we wanted to do with the game. That made it a lot easier for us to start pitching it around to publishers like Microsoft and Sony and such. But it wasn't until I met one of my old colleagues from Bungie. His name's Alan, and Alan and I met for lunch, and he was starting to work with this new publisher out of New York, part of Take-Two. They hadn't named themselves yet, and they were like, he's like, I think you should pitch the game to our group, because what you're doing, what you want to do is build a moderate-sized AAA quality game with a small team that has the highest quality possible and a modest budget, and that's exactly what they were looking for. So it was kind of like this perfect union of like and perfect timing, you know, for us to meet up with him and for us to then get involved with Private Division, which was ultimately the what the studio or the publisher called themselves, and it took a while. You know, we had to go through a green light process even with them of proving that we could grow our team. I could hire on a handful of other people that I know from the industry, as well as hire brand new talent straight out of school. And so while we were only like 10 to 15 people for a majority of the development time, it's not until just this last year that we've grown to about 30 people now.
So last question, I mean, if you were to go back and see yourself 6 years ago and say, you know, we're on the cusp of Disintegration coming out now, what would you tell yourself, and what are your hopes for the game and for the studio?
I wouldn't have believed that we would have gotten this far already. It seems like it's been a long time, but I initially was planning on the studio being super small and us being like this teeny little indie boutique thing. I am so happy and so proud for how the studio has evolved over the course of the last 3.5 years to where we have grown with such great talent, and we have built such an amazing game, in my opinion. Of course, I'm really proud of what we've created together. We took a leap of faith to do something completely different and new, and it was a challenge for sure. It was not easy. And it still isn't easy as we try to wrap up the game amidst a global pandemic and everybody is working from home. So it's a really interesting time for us. This is certainly one of those most memorable dev cycles I've ever been in. That is one for the history books for sure. But we made it work, and I'm really, really happy and proud of V1, the studio, and what we've been able to create as a result.
Great. Thank you so much, Marcus. For more on Disintegration, make sure you stay tuned to GameSpot. And don't forget, we're running Play for all summer for about the next 6 weeks or so, talking about all the newest game announcements, as well as doing a charity drive for Black Lives Matter and Direct Relief. There will be donation links below.